Hey friends, I'm Mitch, and let's do another rapid wargame review for Operational Combat Series via Korea the Forgotten War as an example. Has it been a while since you played? Yeah, forgot a few things. Well, let's do a very high-level overview of the rules. On the top is unit size. Here are the various unit sizes. On the left is regimental equivalent. If it's in yellow, basically how many steps the unit has. Now note, it may not have it in yellow. If not, it could have a name or something else on that side. But either way, for this unit has 3 steps. That's all used for both stacking and obviously step loss after combat. On the bottom we have combat strength. In the middle we have action rating. Action rating is used for both surprise calculation and combat calculations and shifts. On the right, we have movement allowance. And on the far right, we have divisional affiliation, if it's a divisional unit. Speaking of movement, we do have 3 types. White means leg movement, black means truck movement, and red means track movement or tanks. If you do see a yellow background, that also means it's an armored unit. Speaking of stacking, the limit is 10 regimental units, so there's 3, 6, 9, and 10. If you have a small battalion, which is indicated with the 2 up there on the top, then that counts as a 1/2, and replacement units count as 1/4. So let's talk about supply. 1 supply equals 4T. Think of it as $1 and 4 quarters. If I needed to make change, you'll see reference to that. If I needed to use 1T out of this 1 supply, then I would just simply flip it over, and that supply would now be 3T. There are multiple ways to get supply. If you're within 5 movement points of a supply dump, or one of those, then you can just gather supply from that place there. Another way is for a truck or a wagon to move it over to you if you're too far away. They can do that by loading it up on here and then moving it over. Now note that the left side of the truck or wagon is how many supply points it can carry. So it could carry this 1 supply point because it does have a 2 there, so it could carry 1 or 2, but a 5 would be way too heavy for it to carry, and it could not carry it over. Now the movement points on these are 45 and 10 for the wagon. So if you need to load this up, he can only move 10 points to get it to you. And also remember that if he needs to load or unload, then that's going to use 10% of the movement points. So now instead of a 10, he would use 10% of that, or a 1, just to load or unload the supply. Now when you get into the bigger numbers, like 45, 10% of that would be 4.5. You would round that up to 5. So if he carries that over and unloads, he loses 5 movement points just for unloading that supply. Another way to get it to you is to have a headquarters toss it to you. You'll frequently hear that in the games, tossing supply. The number on the left is how many movement points it can toss it. And the number on the right is movement points that are allowed for this unit, which is 0. So when it tosses it, it will basically toss it up to 8 movement points over to you, and then you can use that supply. Now note, when it's tossing the movement points, it can only toss what you're immediately going to move. In other words, he's about to attack, right? And he needs 2T in order to attack a particular unit. So that can get tossed over to him by the headquarters. However, you can't just toss like a massive amount of supply over and save it for later. That's not possible. So again, you can only toss what you're immediately going to use. So if I need 2T, then I can toss 2T over to that unit via the headquarters. So you use supply for things like attacking, in this case this guy attacking or this guy attacking, defending, in case this defender is trying to fend off an attack, he will use some supply as well. And you also use it for moving around a vehicle that needs fuel, such as this particular tank. So how much is required? Well, for 1 per step, T per step. So this will cost 1 T to attack, for example, because it only has 1 step. However, this one over here, obviously he has 3 steps, and so he will cost 3 T to attack if in that particular case. So again, this guy here would only cost 1 T to attack since he's only a battalion or 1 step. Now normally movement is free. For example, if he needs to move, that's going to be free. But since he needs to fuel up, you need to spend 1 T just to fuel him up, and then once he's fueled up, he can move around. So let's talk about defending. This particular guy here is defending. How much does that cost? Well, it'll cost 1 T for 1 regimental equivalent or less. Otherwise, it will end up costing you 2 T to defend. So let's say the enemy is coming in and we left some supply on the board and he's coming in to take it. Well, good news, you can go ahead and just blow it up. For that, you reference the dump blowing table. So what happens if you didn't blow it up in time? Well, I can sneak in here and grab that supply. In that case, we use the capture table to determine how much we can get. Now notice it does have trucks, so if a truck is moving around and I manage to capture it, well, I get some supply. What if I am attacking him and he has no supply to defend himself? That's where the attrition table comes in, to where you can have to roll 2 dice and determine what's going on. Now there is a supply phase to where you need to determine if you can have trace supply. That's not real supply, like you're not really using supply at that point, but the game wants to find out if you have anything around you that can give you some supply, like a toss from an HQ or maybe a rail line or something else. If you don't have any of those things, then unfortunately you're gonna have to be out of supply. Now there are different modes in this game. One is combat. That's the basic combat you have, the main side of the chit. And that is your attack power and your movement rating. Now if you flip it over, that is known as a move mode. And now you'll notice that your combat on the left went way down, but your move on the right went way up. Now if you're already on your move side, you can also enter a state known as strat. And strat basically means you can move at double your movement allowance, which is insane. So if you really need to haul around the map, this is the way to go. Now note, you need to be on the move side, and obviously this is not going to be overpowered. You can't attack. Combat and action rating are now 0, so you really need to be sure that you're not going to move into any trouble. There's another mode called Exploitation. Basically, when you're just awesome, let's say right here, we have Attacker E4, Attacker Exploitation 4, for example. That means that you are so awesome in combat, the game is going to reward you with an exploitation marker. That will allow you to not only attack now, but attack later in the exploitation phase. So you get double attacks for being, well, awesome. You also have a reserve mode, which basically means I don't want to do anything on my turn, but I want to wait until later to do some cool stuff. So let's say that this guy, I know he's going to come over here and start causing problems over here. Maybe I want to go into reserve since I'm kind of useless right now. And then on his turn, I can activate and then start moving around. You obviously need to be careful with this, however, because he could attack you and you can only defend at 1/2 your combat strength instead of the full combat strength, because you're sort of hiding over here and waiting till later. The other problem is once you start moving, you can only move at 1/4 your movement allowance. The last mode is Disorganized. That could happen if one of those annoying planes flew by and barraged you and bombed you and made you disorganized. Maybe an enemy artillery shot at you and made you disorganized, or other ways of disorganized, like if he came and attacked me and I had to move 2 away, at that point I would be disorganized. Or if I retreated into an enemy zone of control, again, that would be another way for me to be disorganized. Now, once you are disorganized, your movement, combat, and barrage values are halved, your action ratings are reduced by 1, and you're unable to overrun or earn exploitation markers like this one. Now keep in mind that disorganized is like a disease. If I have this unit, this unit, this unit, this unit, and this unit in a hex and becomes disorganized, it affects all of the units, even the ones that were not involved in the combat. Speaking of barrage, you can barrage with up to 4 aircraft. Or you can use a standard artillery unit. On the left side is your barrage rating. In the middle, not only is your action rating, but it's how far you can barrage. In this case, 2. And on the right is obviously your movement points. Now notice it's white, it counts as leg movement points. Now the barrage table has tons and tons of different shifts for defending hex, terrain, density, etc., etc. But keep in mind that when it says how much supply it's going to cost you, you want to use the number of the base before the shifts. So don't use the cost after the shift. So in this case I have 13 barrage strength, which is going to fall right here. So that means that I'm going to use 3T to do the barrage, even if once I shift left 3 times or whatever, it says 2T, ignore that, you're using 3T. Now obviously for the results, the actual results, you're going to do the shift, roll a dice, and then figure out what happens, which is usually a disorganized. Speaking of stages, the first one you're going to do is the weather stage. For that we're going to use the weather table. We're going to roll 1d6, and we got a 2. A 2, since it's July, would mean no flight. Next you're going to roll to determine who goes first. Next you're going to move things around in the aircraft refit stage. That will use the variable replacements. And inside your book that will also use the arrival schedule as well for the particular date that you're playing. And finally, on the chart that's included with your game, you'll have the replacements table as well. As per the manual, they come in 2 types: equipment, EQ, and personnel, PAX. Next comes the movement phase, which is where I can move my units around their movement allowance, obviously factoring in the standard terrain effects chart. Now you notice the effects chart has track, truck, and leg, which correspond to the red, black, and white on the movement. But during the movement phase I could do an overrun attack, which is basically I'm going to run up and I'm just going to slam into them while I'm moving and attack them. Now this costs 3 movement points extra to do an overrun attack. And an overrun attack has a little more oomph to it as well on the chart. In addition, if I have a lot of movement points, which I don't here, but for example, if I had a lot of movement points and I did an overrun attack onto that guy and I destroyed him, if I still have enough movement points left, I can do another overrun attack on him, or if I didn't destroy him, on him again, or I can move over here and do another overrun attack as well. So if you have enough movement points, you can literally be the juggernaut and just run around decimating the landscape. Speaking of movement, what about zones of control, you asked? I'm glad you asked. There is no zone of control, oddly, for a unit coming up can move all around here as long as he's not a truck. For some reason, when a truck gets into the zone of control, he has to stop moving. But the other units can move around, taunt the unit, make fun of this unit's mother, anything that they would like to do. Obviously, like in every game, getting on a road greatly enhances your movement speed, just literally like every game. And terrain will affect the movement speed as well. So the next phase is the supply phase, where we use trace supply. That basically means I'm not going to use any supply at this point. The game is just checking to make sure that you can get supply at this stage of the game before we go into things like combat and reaction and things like that. So trace supply means, theoretically, can I get supply? In this case, I think that's five away. So yes, 5 away, that's good. Maybe I have a headquarters that can toss me some supply if he's way far away and I don't have anybody nearby. Sure, now I can still get supply, so I'm good. So check mark, you're good. If you're out of supply, then bad things start to happen. And unfortunately, you got combat phase coming up. So you don't want bad things to happen. Please stay in supply. Next phase is the reaction phase. That is, if I was smart enough to put this unit in reserve, I can take them out of reserve and do things like move around and things like this in the reaction phase. If I wasn't smart enough to put this unit in reserve, it's not my turn. I can't do anything. But if I did have a reserve and it's his turn, the reaction phase means I could actually do stuff. Now it's time for the combat phase, everyone's favorite beast. Barrages are going to go first. Where's my plane? No, it's not the plane. But yeah, barrages are going to go first. Barrage, we're going to do that barrage thing. We have to pay supply. Everything in this game costs supply. So let's say I'm barraging with 13. On the barrage, that would be here. That's going to cost me 3T. So let's say I have a 5 over here. Let's go ahead and start paying for this stuff. So now instead of 5, I used 3T according to that barrage table. So let's make change. 5 is no more. I now have 4 and 1T. You remember 1 supply equals 4T, $1.04. Now we come to this unit, which looks like he only has 1 step, therefore it'll cost 1T. So let's deduct 1T out of our bank, and we'll attack with him. Let's assume he's here. We'll attack with him and mark him as paid for in the combat phase. Now I need to pay for him. Now you'll notice he has a little 3 in yellow. That means 3 steps. That is going to cost 3T. So now instead of 4, I'm going to have 3 and 1T left in my supply, if I can move this. And mark him as attacked as well. And then he attacks. Now I pay for the defender to defend in supply. I believe that is 1 RE. That's a regiment, right? I believe that is 1 RE, and so therefore we will only have to pay 1T of supply to make him defend. So we need to find the difference between their action rating to start the actual combat. For example, this one has a 3 in the middle, and this one has a 2 in the middle. So he is the attacker. He is going to have 1 more action rating than the defender. At this point, you roll 2 dice. For example, here we got a 7. And since that is a regular attack, if it's 10 or more, attacker gains surprise. If it's 5 or less, defender gains surprise. Since neither one of these occurred, then nobody has surprise. Now we're going to look at the defender's terrain. In other words, the terrain that he's sitting on. Let's assume, for example, that this is very close terrain. Now you're going to look at the chart under the very close row of the top section. The very close row, you're going to go to the right and determine the combat odds. Let's say the combat odds are even in this case, 5 to 5. We're going to get very close and we're going to do 1 to 1 right here. Now we roll, and then you're going to add the difference between their action ratings. In this case, it was 3 to 2, which was a +1 difference. So instead of 12, we now have 13. Now I'm going to scroll down here to the 13 section, and for very close, A01 DL101. Combat results are resolved with the attacker first. An option means that I can move or I could lose a step. Now you remember that this is one step, so lose a step means I go away. So it's probably better if I have option 1 to just retreat 1. Now if you have a multi-step unit like this one here with the 3, that's 3 steps, then he could lose a step. To do that, you will grab the skull and permanently attach it to the bottom of his rear end. And now, instead of 3, he only has 2 steps, and that is a step loss. Now, when you see an L, that means loses 1. So that would be a loss. There's no option to move or lose a step. There's only to lose a step. So if the defender lost a step, for example, he would be vacated, and we get to move into his space. Now keep in mind, when you lose a step, you will now fight at 1/2 combat when attacking. So instead of a 12, because I lost a step, I'm now fighting attack-wise at a 6. So if you have an option for the attacker and the defender has an option as well, and the attacker takes his option as a retreat, then the defendant doesn't have to do anything. He can just sit there and kind of watch this guy move around. Now occasionally you'll be a Superman and your attack was so awesome that you get an E4 or an E2, etc. And that means that you get an exploitation marker, which means not only can you attack now, but you can attack in the next phase called the Exploitation Phase. So what happens in the Exploitation Phase? If I have an exploitation marker, I can go again. Or if I'm reserved, I could theoretically unreserve and move at 1/2 my movement allowance. And lastly, the cleanup phase. We're going to remove DGs, we're going to remove exploitation markers, and sort of go back to normal. So we can restart for the next phase.